The scene opens not with battle, but with a mess hall in Texas. Late summer of 1944, 100 young men in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, their boots dusty from long train rides across the continent, sit at wooden tables waiting for food. They expect humiliation, coarse treatment, perhaps rotten bread. Instead, an American sergeant places small utility knives alongside their trays of beans and cornbread. These are not the heavy steel implements of Solingen that they once carried proudly in the field, but light, folding pocket knives stamped from American factories. The reaction is immediate. A chorus of laughter echoes through the hall. One prisoner, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kessler, smirks and declares in German, "For children, perhaps, not for soldiers." Another, young mechanic Carl Brenner, shakes his head and compares them to tin toys sold at Christmas markets. Yet beneath the laughter there is something darker, pride, forged in years of propaganda. Told these men that Germany's blades were unmatched symbols of discipline and heritage. They remembered their fathers carrying knives from Solingen, where centuries of blacksmithing tradition had created steel that was said to bite into oak like butter. These flimsy American tools seemed an insult, an unworthy gesture from a land they imagined was crude and without culture. The guards ignored the mockery, their faces expressionless. They had heard it before. To them, the knives were not ornaments, but instruments of survival. In the field, American GIs had used them to cut bandages, strip wires, slice meat, and pry open crates. To the POWs, the gesture seemed laughable. To the Americans, it was routine. A letter later found in the belongings of Private Franz Richter captures the mood of that evening. "They hand us toys with our food. I nearly choked laughing. Do they really believe these little blades could replace a soldier's knife? I pity them, with their factories and their foolish pride, but the laughter masked a deeper unease. These prisoners were already beginning to measure the gap between their memories of a collapsing Reich and the strange new reality of captivity in America. What they mocked might soon return to confront them in ways they did not expect. And so the scene closes with the sound of metal snapping shut, the click of American pocket knives being folded by guards, sharp, efficient, almost mocking in return. It was a sound the POWs would come to remember. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And before we continue, share your location and your local time in the comments. It is always moving to see where these stories are heard. The laughter of the mess hall echoed long after that first night, but it was rooted in something deeper than amusement. These men carried with them the pride of Solingen, the German city that had been forging blades since the Middle Ages. They remembered its forges glowing red through winter fog, the steady hammering of smiths shaping steel that would be carried by hunters, farmers, and soldiers alike for generations. Solingen's name had been stamped on cutlery exported across Europe, a mark of prestige as recognizable as fine porcelain from Meissen or violins from Cremona to the prisoners. Their heritage of steel seemed unshakable, invincible. One diary fragment, written by Unteroffizier Wilhelm Drexler, captures this pride. "My grandfather's knife was Solingen steel. He cut bread, hemp rope, even bone. We laughed when the Americans gave us their folding knives. Nothing forged in haste could match ours." His words reflect not only nostalgia, but also the arrogance of men who believed in the cultural superiority of German craft. Yet what they remembered so fondly was already fading. By 1943, many of the Solingen workshops had been commandeered for the war effort. Skilled artisans were forced to mass-produce bayonets and combat knives, with quality often sacrificed for speed. Allied bombing raids crippled the Ruhr industrial region, leaving shortages of coal and steel. Statistics tell the story starkly. By 1944, Solingen's output of civilian cutlery had dropped by more than 60% compared to pre-war levels. What remained was increasingly crude, produced under duress, its makers hungry and weary. Meanwhile, in America, the prisoners found themselves surrounded by a different kind of industry. The United States did not carry centuries of guild traditions, but it wielded scale and efficiency. The POWs could not yet see the Chicago assembly lines or the stamping presses in Pennsylvania. But whispers among guards and farmers reached their ears. Factories running day and night, blades rolling off belts by the millions, shipped not only to soldiers, but also to civilians, hunters, and workers. Where Germany's strength had once been craftsmanship, America's strength lay in abundance. Gossip drifted through the barracks. One man claimed he overheard a guard bragging that the Camillus Cutlery Company in New York had supplied millions of pocket knives to the U.S. Army. Another swore that in the Midwest, women on factory lines sharpened blades faster than a skilled smith could forge a single one. These stories sounded like exaggerations, and the POWs dismissed them as propaganda. But still, a seed of doubt lodged itself in their minds. At night, as cicadas hummed in the Texas heat, some prisoners whispered about their father's knives, comparing their weight, balance, and sharpness. They boasted, but their voices betrayed uncertainty. Could it be that crude, mass-produced American knives might actually serve better than their proud Solingen steel? The question remained unspoken in public, yet it hung in the air like the dust of a battlefield not yet settled. The pride of Solingen was real, but in captivity. It would soon be tested against realities the men had never imagined. The question of pride met its first challenge, not in barracks gossip, but in the roar of American industry. In 1944, when the German prisoners were herded by rail into the interior of the United States, they passed landscapes unlike anything they had imagined. Smokestacks rising higher than cathedrals, rivers lined with cranes, endless trains of boxcars painted with fresh military markings. It was here that they began to understand the scale of what they faced, an industrial machine that operated on a rhythm beyond their comprehension. The story of American knives was part of this larger picture in Chicago. The Union stockyards not only butchered cattle on an unimaginable scale, but their byproducts fueled a secondary industry, knives for both soldiers and workers. In New York, the Camillus Cutlery Company produced over 13 million knives during the war, each stamped with U.S. and distributed through quartermasters to the front lines. In Pennsylvania, the Case and Coopmaster companies operated around the clock, their assembly lines producing folding knives in less than 2 minutes each, where a Solingen craftsman might need hours to forge, grind, and sharpen a single blade. American conveyor belts turned out hundreds in the same span. The numbers were staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 37 million utility knives were issued to American servicemen. They were carried into Normandy, into the jungles of the Pacific, and into the desert heat of North Africa. By contrast, Germany's knife production diverted heavily into bayonets, and weapon parts struggled to maintain even basic supplies. In fact, records show that by late 1944, Wehrmacht units were reusing captured Allied equipment, including American pocket knives, due to shortages. For the POWs, who had mocked those same knives as toys, these statistics remained invisible. What they did see, however, were hints of scale. They noticed guards casually sharpening pencils, slicing bread, or trimming wire with the same folding knife they had scoffed at. They observed black American workers on farms, using them to repair machinery, their movements quick and confident. Even the smallest tasks seemed to reveal a hidden efficiency. Anecdotes spread through the camps. One guard joked that his pocket knife had opened more crates than he could count, from canned peaches to rifles. Another bragged that the same blade had cut parachute cords during training exercises. These were not grand boasts of craftsmanship, but offhand remarks that hinted at a tool embedded in everyday life, far removed from ritualized pride. At night, prisoners reflected uneasily. The Solingen knife had been an heirloom, a symbol of tradition and permanence. The American knife, by contrast, was disposable, mass-produced, and yet it was everywhere. That ubiquity carried its own power for the first time. Some prisoners began to sense that the balance of war was not measured only in tanks or aircraft, but in the unrelenting hum of factories, in the countless small tools that supported an army. As one POW muttered bitterly while staring at a guard slicing rope with ease, "Perhaps this is their strength, not the blade itself, but the millions behind it." The turning point arrived in the form of a demonstration, almost casual, yet unforgettable. One humid afternoon in September 1944, at a camp in Huntsville, Texas, a U.S. Corporal named James O'Malley leaned against a fence post while supervising a work detail of German POWs. In his hand, barely noticed at first, was the same folding knife that had provoked so much laughter in the mess hall weeks earlier. But O'Malley was not interested in jokes. He was repairing a section of barbed wire, the kind that frayed gloves and tore skin. With a flick, he extended the blade and cut clean through the tangled strands. The wire snapped, recoiling in silence. The prisoners who watched froze, stunned by what seemed impossible. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kessler, the same man who had mocked the knife as a child's toy, exchanged a glance with his fellow soldiers in Solingen workshops. Cutting through barbed wire required special pliers, heavy and awkward. Here, in the hands of an American guard, a pocket knife did it as if slicing an apple. One prisoner muttered under his breath, "Unmöglich, impossible." Yet the evidence lay on the ground, coils of wire curling like defeated snakes. The demonstration did not end there. O'Malley, aware of his audience, then pulled a block of hardwood from a supply crate. He pressed the blade in, rocking it back and forth until the wood split. No hesitation, no pause, only the gleam of sharp steel and the efficiency of a tool designed for versatility. He closed the knife with a snap and tossed the wood aside as though it were nothing more than firewood. Word spread through the barracks that evening. Some prisoners insisted there must be a trick, that the guard had used hidden cutters. Others argued it was the quality of American steel, perhaps secretly hardened. Yet each retelling carried the same undertone, disbelief giving way to grudging respect. A diary fragment from Unteroffizier Wilhelm Drexler later revealed the moment's impact. The knife cut through wire like bread. We said nothing, but all of us thought the same. If even their tools are like this, what chance had we? Statistics reinforced the truth. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps had distributed more than 5 million multi-purpose knives by 1944, each tested to cut rope, wood, and even wire. Soldiers carried them on D-Day to free themselves from parachute harnesses, and sailors used them to sever lines in emergencies for the POWs. These knives were no longer curiosities, they were instruments tied to survival and victory. That night in the barracks, silence replaced laughter. The men remembered their fathers' heavy knives, sharp but limited, and compared them to the American blades now cutting through everything they touched. Pride faltered. Some still scoffed in public, but alone. Many admitted what they could no longer deny: they had underestimated not only a knife, but the nation behind it. The sound of barbed wire snapping under a small blade lingered in their minds as shocking as the crash of artillery, but quieter, more intimate. A sound that symbolized a deeper defeat. The laughter that once filled the mess halls had long vanished by the winter of 1944-45. What replaced it was something quieter, more dangerous to pride's silence. It appeared in the barracks at night, when men sat with pens poised over thin scraps of paper, writing letters that might never leave America. Guards intercepted most of them, but decades later. Historians uncovered these drafts in archives, fragile testaments of shifting minds. One letter, written in January 1945 by Oberleutnant Ernst Falk to his wife in Dresden, captures this reluctant concession. They give us knives, small and folding, nothing like the steel of Solingen, but I must confess, dearest, these strange blades are miracles of industry. They cut wire, wood, meat, everything. I thought them toys. Now I think them clever. His words, meant never to be read by outsiders, show the slow collapse of certainty in men who had once sworn by German craftsmanship. Another fragment came from Karl Brenner, the mechanic who had once mocked the knives as tin toys. His scribbled note reads, "If you ever see one, keep it. They are not beautiful, but they work. They always work." Such confessions, written in the half-light of barracks under armed watch, reveal the hidden transformation. The statistics that surrounded them only deepened the truth. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories produced more than 1.5 million additional knives per month, flooding not only the battlefields but also civilian life. Housewives used them to open canned goods. Farmers carried them in dung-soiled overalls. Unlike the Solingen blades reserved for hunters or soldiers, the American knife belonged to everyone. It democratized sharpness, and in the POW camps, gossip added its own flavor. Some men whispered that even generals in the Wehrmacht had once carried captured American knives for their reliability. Others swore they had seen SS officers in France confiscate them from fallen paratroopers, keeping them for personal use. These stories spread like embers, igniting both envy and discomfort. Could it be that the very knives they had laughed at were prized even by their own elite, by this stage of captivity? The ideological wall had begun to crack. It was not propaganda that shook them. It was the daily evidence in their own hands. A knife that sliced through frozen bread without splintering, that carved wooden pegs for improvised repairs, that opened crates of rations with a flick. The ridicule of summer had hardened into a reluctant admiration of winter. And here lies a question for you, the viewer, if you had been in their place, stripped of pride and surrounded by proof of another nation's ingenuity. How quickly would you admit respect, or would you, too, cling to silence, ashamed to confess what your hands already knew? Share your thoughts below. It is in these comparisons that history comes alive. By the spring of 1945, the war was drawing to a close, and German prisoners found themselves shuttled across the American landscape. What struck them most was not the barracks or the fences, but the continuity of abundance. In Texas, they had seen knives used to cut through wire. In Louisiana, they saw them slice sugarcane stalks cleanly in the fields. In Wisconsin, as winter thawed into mud, the same knives opened crates of dried apples, split kindling for stoves, and carved makeshift chess pieces in idle hours. Wherever they went, the knives followed part of the silent rhythm of American life. The journey itself was a lesson in contrasts. Trains rattled northward through farmlands where every station seemed to hold stacks of wooden crates and machinery parts. POWs whispered in disbelief. So this is why they never run out. Along the way, they watched American workers of every background, men, women, even teenagers carrying pocket knives. Unlike the guild traditions of Solingen, this was not an elite craft, but an everyday possession, carried as naturally as a handkerchief. In Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a small incident etched itself into memory. A farmer supervising a POW work crew dropped a bale of hay bound with wire. Without pause, he drew his folding knife, cut through the wire, and handed the freed hay to the prisoners. It was such a simple act, yet it left them murmuring late into the night. Hans Kessler, once so scornful, remarked quietly, "It is not the blade, but the idea, a tool for every task, always ready." That admission silenced the barracks. Statistics gave these impressions weight. By 1945, more than 90% of U.S. infantrymen carried a utility knife. The War Department had issued over 36 million in total, making them as common as helmets or canteens. Compare that to Germany, where shortages forced men to improvise with bayonets, dull blades, or no tool at all. The difference was not in craftsmanship, but in reliability, in the guarantee that every soldier and even every farmer had what he needed in his pocket. These knives became more than tools to the prisoners. They were symbols of something unsettling, the American ability to turn factories into weapons, not just of war, but of daily life. Some POWs debated endlessly in the barracks, torn between pride in their heritage and the undeniable evidence before them. One confessed in a diary fragment, "We said we were the engineers of Europe, but they make the world into a workshop." Now let me ask you directly, if you were one of these men, watching your old certainties collapse in the face of such quiet efficiency, what would you feel? Envy, shame, or perhaps relief, knowing that a culture of abundance might be kinder than one of scarcity? Tell me in the comments. Your perspective adds a new layer to this forgotten story. By the final summer of the war, news of Germany's surrender filtered into the camps, and the prisoners' world shifted again. The rifles no longer mattered, nor did the uniforms or ranks. What remained were the small, daily encounters with America, and among them, nothing proved as enduring as the pocket knife. For men who had entered captivity mocking these folding blades, the transformation was profound. The knives became part of camp life, slipped into toolkits for repairs, borrowed to cut firewood, used to whittle spoons and figurines. What had once been a symbol of contempt now became a bridge between enemies. An American guard might loan his knife to a POW repairing a wagon axle, or hand it over to open a crate of Red Cross parcels. The gesture was small, but in the quiet of captivity, It carried weight. Oberleutnant Ernst Falk, who had once mocked the knives in letters, wrote in his final entry before repatriation, "I never thought a blade could humble me, not by fear, but by persistence. This knife, which I ridiculed, became part of our survival. It is America in miniature, unassuming, everywhere, effective." His words, discovered decades later, resonate as more than personal confession. They capture a cultural collision that went deeper than weapons or battles. These statistics tell the closing story. By VJ Day in August 1945, the United States had produced nearly 40 million knives for military use, enough to equip not only its own troops but also allies across the globe. Germany, by comparison, could no longer supply even basic cutlery to its civilian population. A nation that once prided itself on craftsmanship now stood dependent on relief shipments, including American goods, a reversal as symbolic as it was material. In the barracks, the knives took on a meaning that was never spoken aloud. They were reminders of humiliation, yes, but also of resilience and adaptation. A knife that sliced bread or cut rope was not merely a tool, it was a quiet statement of what industrial might could achieve when paired with practicality. And when the men finally boarded ships back to Europe, many carried with them a memory sharper than any blade. The echo of metal snapping shut, that crisp click of a folding knife lingered in their minds as they stepped onto ruined German soil. It was the sound of a world that had shifted, a reminder that the tools of victory were not only tanks and bombers, but also the humble objects that filled pockets and hands. The laughter that had begun the story was gone. What remained was silence. And in that silence, a quiet respect. When the story of war is told, it is often measured in divisions and tonnage, in tanks rolled from assembly lines and aircraft that darkened the skies. Yet history is not only written by thunder, sometimes it is etched by the quiet scrape of steel against wood, the snap of a knife folding shut, the silence of men forced to admit what they once ridiculed. For the German prisoners of war in America, the humble pocket knife was not merely a tool, it was a revelation. They had entered captivity certain of their superiority, clinging to the legacy of Solingen and the pride of craft passed down through generations. But what they encountered was something they had not been prepared to confront: a culture where efficiency outweighed ornament, where abundance replaced exclusivity, and where even the smallest implements spoke of a society mobilized on a scale beyond imagination. The knife cut more than rope and wire. It cut into assumptions, pride, and the fragile boundary between enemy and fellow man. In later years, many of these men would confess that what haunted them was not the humiliation of defeat, but the memory of those small, daily encounters: a guard handing over a knife without hesitation, a farmer cutting hay, a child using the same blade to carve an apple. They dreamed not of bombers or artillery, but of that simple sound, the sharp click of steel closing into its case, a sound both ordinary and eternal. Perhaps that is the lesson worth carrying, that the true power of nations is not only in their armies, but in the resilience of their everyday tools, in the way industry can weave itself into the smallest details of life, and that history's sharpest edges are not always the ones forged for killing, but those that reveal who we are when pride gives way to truth.